Hello, I'm Dr. Lucia Palmer, and welcome to my presentation. You'll notice a slight change in the title that I changed as my research evolved from what is written in the schedule. Um, so the title of my presentation is Enemies and Victims, Mediations of Migrant Children in U.S. Detention Centers. The image you see here is actually a screenshot of a Google image search from March 16th of this year. And I typed in the keywords children, immigration in US-Mexico border, and these were the top hits. If you've been paying attention to news recently, you'll know that there has been a recent increase in news coverage alongside a recent increase in young migrants arriving at the US-Mexico border from Central America. What's of concern for me here is the repetition of similar images across sort of ideological perspectives of media sources and political rhetoric that is often partisan in nature, and across a number of years. Some of these images that you'll see here are likely familiar to you, and some of them appear in some of the stories that I'm going to spotlight in this presentation. I began to think about the topic of this presentation as I was doing research in 2018 and watching a lot of the public outcry around family separation and Trump's zero tolerance policies, and realizing that a lot of the images that I'd actually seen either directly before a repetition of the same image or in very similar ways, but coming from what I was researching at the time, which was nativist media, especially from Breitbart. So this presentation is going to spotlight media in particular on the right, but I want to think about it in relation to broader visual stories that we're telling. And of concern here is the repetition of things like young faces gazing at us through fences, through barbed wires, through bars, women and children huddled together in masses, and small bodies huddled under mylar blankets and on bare-bone floors. So you see this in news coverage in 2014, often accompanied by terms like you'll see here in the NPR story from 2014 on the left, words like flood and overwhelm. From a stream to a flood, migrant kids overwhelm U.S. border agents. And then in 2018, you heard rhetoric about family separation and kids in cages. We are still now in violation of a lot of the legal restrictions on the period of detention for children, families. Little has changed since the outcry, even if the protests have died down. And this is from, the image on your right is from a news story, more recent news story from the Washington Post. Why are there so many children coming to the US from Central America? And you see an image of a young person gazing at you, gazing at the lens. And my concern here is in these similar images that you see repeated, they can be used in ways to stoke fear, as you'll see by Breitbart, and different frameworks to stoke pity through sort of depictions of abjection and pitiful circumstances. And what I'm concerned with is neither of these frameworks really work to question hegemonic constructions of immigration as a threat, as a problem to be dealt with, as even an existential threat to the United States and its population. And it does little to challenge the basic structure of US citizenship that's based on the framework of us versus them, which enable a lot of these inhumane treatments and detentions in the first place. I want to position this in relation to Leo Chavez's influential work on the Latino threat narrative. And this is, I want to spotlight in particular Chavez because he has been influential and also because he unpacks representations of the Latinx other as a threat or danger to the US nation through binaries that construct sort of this essential difference between citizen versus foreigner, real Americans versus Mexicans or Latinos, us versus them, and legitimate versus illegal. And I also want to put this in conversation with what he writes about media spectacles of immigration. And spectacles are important when we're thinking about looking at these images. He argues that these spectacles objectify Latinx immigrants, and this is a dehumanizing act. And in this dehumanizing act, it's easier to lack empathy and to pass policies and laws that govern and limit immigration. I'm also in conversation with Megan Strom and Emily Alcock's 2017 critical discourse analysis that looks at how a lot of the themes unpacked by Chavez in the Latino threat narrative and others through broader representational practices continue to circulate and are used to actually construct the virtual lives of children and teenage immigrants, as well as adults. And their critical discourse analysis of English language mainstream media in the United States. They look at how unaccompanied minors arriving at the border from Central America who are applying for asylum in increased numbers, how they're represented. And they spotlighted the New York Times and Los Angeles Times because of their large readership. And overall, they found a representational pattern of these children and teenagers being represented as a problem requiring a solution. And a particularly salient metaphor that they found, and I've also found in my own work, is the metaphor of a flood, where you have reoccurring words like flood, wave, surge, paired alongside words like overwhelm and crisis. It calls upon fears of natural disaster, stokes fears of immigrants and immigration as destructive for the United States and its population. And they suggest two possible ideological effects of this metaphor of flooding. First is a proactive effect that suggests that the United States must take action to stop the surge. And second, a fear-based defensive reaction to immigration as a natural disaster. You can see this. This is from a story, a recent story at Fox News, that this rhetoric continues. And what I want to add to this, what I want to spotlight in this presentation, is the pairing of this rhetoric of floods, of waves, of surges, of crisis, of overwhelming the state, alongside images such as the one you see here, of sort of small bodies contained inside a fence or bars. Some legal context as well that's important to understand is the Flores settlement, which was a legal agreement settled on in 1997, outlining certain protection for immigrant children in U.S. custody. And part of why this is an important context to bring in is because it demonstrates the longue durée that the U.S. has been detaining young people subjecting them to harsh treatment and detaining them for longer than is considered humane. So this is from the Reagan administration, actually. Jenny Flores, who was a 15-year-old girl fleeing a civil war in El Salvador, she was detained in the U.S. She was strip searched, and she was detained without education or recreation or other sort of supports before being deported. So her case, the settlement in her case, which has been negotiated and struggled over by a number of different administrations, standards that are still applied or meant to be applied about the treatment and living condition for minors and children, so people under 18 years old arriving at the U.S.-Mexico border. And one part that has become particularly salient recently is that it prohibits detaining minors for more than 20 days. But the U.S. has recurrently been found to be in violation of this under the Obama administration, under the Trump administration, and it continues to this day. And despite rulings that the U.S. government is continuing to violate the Flores settlement, minors continue to be detained for long periods of time in poor conditions, things like really cold facilities, centers that aren't meant to hold people for more than a number of hours, lacking sanitary products, proper nutrition, things like that continue. And I want to give some context to this in 2014 before I turn to Breitbart. This is an article actually analyzed by Strom and Alcock, and you can see that this is from the New York Times. So even in sort of the more mainstream media coverage, you have rhetoric about emergency, crisis, the border authorities being overwhelmed by a surge, and emphasis on children being packed into facilities. And the image here, you don't see the boy's face, and in some of the more, I guess, sympathetic coverage, they often refrain from using faces, which you will not see being replicated by Breitbart in a moment. But I want you to think of some of the visual similarities and the rhetorical similarities that you'll see. So in 2014, Breitbart also had a lot of coverage of this, and this is from an original leaked article that I saw surface in a number of other places in nativist spaces online and nativist media, that came from these original Breitbart Texas released photos from a facility in Texas. And basically, this published article, leaked images reveal children warehoused in crowded U.S. cells, Border Patrol overwhelmed, was a series of images like this. And you can see sort of crowded facilities. It looks a little grainy, a little like surveillance imagery. Fluorescent lighting is definitely apparent in these images, which gives it a sort of authenticity, I think, that it feels, and this is emphasized in the article, feels like we were being exposed to something that was hidden. Breitbart itself was fascinated in particular by this one image of a room full of young boys. There appeared to be dirty walls, and they're just sort of packed in, laying on top of each other on the floor. This was on the left. You see that screenshot from the original story, an image placed in a primary spot in that story. What's really interesting to me is that it emerges in a number of other spaces. For example, on the right, this is actually a screenshot from a documentary called The Border States of America, which was made by the Tea Party Patriots and circulated in nativist circles. And it uses images from this Breitbart release, and in particular, this one. Also, Breitbart itself recirculated this image in particular and some of the other images from that original story and a number of stories following it in 2014 and sort of 2015 as well. You can see in this article, it emphasizes that it's sort of placing blame on the state government, and in particular the Obama administration, but emphasizing packed in, overwhelmed facilities, the sense that officials are being overwhelmed. So less emphasizing the poor conditions for migrants and more implying corruption in the government and the inability to address the assumed problem. You can also see how these original images were sort of taken and recycled by Breitbart, and articles that are mostly geared towards partisan rhetoric. For example, on the left-hand side, again, this is from the original sort of Breitbart article where it released photos from inside a Texas detention facility, and it's used in a story about how Sarah Palin is accused President Obama of, the quote is, turning America into an unfunded charity for illegal immigrants to invade and overrun. The story has little news value besides that Sarah Palin said something, but you can see how this sort of image was taken out of its original context and used to be associated with invasion and overrunning our resources. On the right, again, you see this image that was such an object of fascination, used in a number of other places. One article, for example, used it to talk about Congressman Randy Weber of Texas introducing a bill to hold Central American nations accountable for their output of immigrants. In 2018, amidst the media spectacle around separated families and children in detention facilities, Breitbart used images of children and these facilities to sort of question what they called mainstream media narratives, and to question the fact that they were being treated poorly. So, for example, this is a story that really emphasized. You can see that the images of this facility. It looks a lot more clean, sort of streamlined. And they had a number of photos of this boy you see here watching a movie. What's concerning to me here as well is these are also photos from the same story. And these photos are very similar from a lot of the other stories in mainstream media at the time, and a lot of the rhetoric that circulated about the vulnerability and inhumane treatment of these migrants. And it's concerning because here it's being used to question the the, the criticism of the Trump administration, versus in other places the basically the same images are used to critique the treatment. And I think it evidences the way that images of vulnerable young bodies can be utilized for threat, for fear, for pity, all at the same time. To conclude, I want to put this into context with media coverage, articles written from 2020 and more recently than that. So, for example, here you have this sort of iconic image that I've seen in a number of places. And this is from the Council on Foreign Relations backgrounder on child migrant detention. And it was the article is mostly informative. It summarizes what it calls a surge in apprehensions of unaccompanied migrant children, as well as sort of legal and court cases and struggles over their treatment and governing that. In the image, this young girl looks out at the lens from behind barbed wire, happy and playful, but sort of trapped at the same time. And it's a striking contrast that's made a compelling image that you see circulated over and over again. At the same time, you also see images like this. This is actually from the Marshall Project, and it's a story written directly criticizing the Trump administration, directly criticizing overcrowding and poor conditions. But again, you see an image that is very strikingly similar to images used by Breitbart to stoke fear. And finally, a really recent CBS News story of children behind fences, and their faces are blurred, which is perhaps a recognition of their dignity and humanity. But I want to question, and I want to leave it with these images here, because we continue to see images of abjection surrounded by rhetoric about waves, floods, and surges. And at the same time, the conditions haven't changed, that these children and these people are still mired in legal proceedings. They're still detained for long periods of time and in pretty terrible conditions, while the outcry and public protests have declined. And I think this raises questions about our responses to images of suffering and how the images function as discourse and rhetoric themselves. Thank you.